The knock came at 8:53 on Christmas morning, and I was already dressed. I want you to understand that. I was already dressed, already standing in my kitchen with my coffee going cold on the counter, already watching through the front window when my father's gray Buick pulled up to the curb. I had been awake since 5:40. I had not slept well. I had the leather appointment book open on the kitchen table with a single page flagged in red, and the copper kettle was going on the stove, and the small handwritten ledger I had kept for the past 14 months was in the drawer beside the oven where I had put it the night before, in a folder I had labeled clearly and would not need to look for. He did not know any of that. He never did. My name is Fiona Galloway, and I am 47 years old, and the Christmas morning my father came to my door expecting a daughter who would stay quiet, he found something different. He found someone who had already made every decision she needed to make 6 weeks before his car turned onto my street. He brought my mother, which I had expected. He had a foil-wrapped casserole dish, which I had not. He did not bring the investigator. That part arrived on its own. I need you to understand my father the way I came to understand him. Not as a monster, because he isn't one, but as a man shaped entirely by the logic that money and family were the same currency, and that both could be borrowed and repaid whenever it was convenient for him. Robert Galloway is 71 years old. He worked for 34 years as a regional manager at a plumbing supply company in Tilbury, the town where I grew up, and by every visible measure, he had a successful career. He was good with numbers. He was organized. He could read a spreadsheet with the fluency of someone who had spent his working life in them. He also retired at 64 on a pension that turned out to cover significantly less than he had planned for, and he spent the years between 64 and 68 making a series of financial decisions. A boat he could not afford, a property investment that lost value steadily, 2 years of paying for my brother Owen's legal troubles out of pocket. That left him, by the time I was 43, in a position he found genuinely frightening. I understand this. I have thought about it carefully, and I understand it. A man who built his entire sense of safety around financial competence, discovering at 68 that the competence had gaps, that is not a small thing. That is the kind of fear that gets into a person's thinking and bends it. What it does not excuse is what he did next. The first credit line opened in my name in January 3 years ago. It was a store card at a national furniture retailer, and the credit limit was $4,200, and I did not find out about it until April, when a payment due notice arrived at my address with my name on it and a balance I did not recognize. I called the retailer. They had my name, my date of birth, my social security number, my Millhaven address. They had my mother's maiden name as the security verification. The second line opened in March. A personal loan through an online lender. $7,500. The payment history showed one on-time payment followed by 6 months of missed payments. The third opened in August of that same year. Another store card. $3,800 limit. Already at $3,611.47 in charges at the time I discovered it. I found all three within the same 2-week period in September, when my credit score dropped 41 points, and I sat down to understand why. I will tell you what I did in those 2 weeks, and I will tell you what I did not do. I did not call my father and confront him. I did not send an angry message. I did not call my brother Owen, who knew about everything and said nothing, and whose name appeared on the lender's secondary contact form in at least one of the accounts. I did not call my mother, who I believed and still believe, did not know the full shape of what had been done, only that Robert had been handling some paperwork and that everything would be fine. What I did was this. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a yellow legal pad, and I documented everything. Every account, every open date, every charge I could trace, every payment missed, every address and phone number on record. I printed the statements. I organized them in a green folder by account and by date. I made 3 copies. 1 stayed at my house. 1 went to a friend. 1 I put in a safe deposit box at the credit union on Faro Street. And then I called the fraud department at all 3 creditors to initiate disputes. And then I called an attorney named Carly Sue, who a colleague of mine had used 2 years earlier for a contract issue, and I sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon for an hour and a half, and I explained what I had found. Carly said, "Have you confronted your father?" I said, "No." She said, "Good. Don't." Not yet. She explained my options. What a formal identity theft report would trigger. What the creditors were required to do. What the insurance investigator process looked like if a fraudulent insurance claim was also involved. And it turned out that one of the charges on the third account was to a home warranty insurance product that had a claim filed against it in my name for a property at an address I had never lived at. That last piece was the piece that changed the shape of what was happening from a family dispute into something that had its own institutional momentum. I had not manufactured that. It was already there, waiting for someone to pull the thread. I filed the reports in November, 6 weeks before Christmas. I told no one in my family. I want to be precise about this. I am a tax accountant by profession. I have worked for the same regional firm for 19 years, and I understand what documentation means, and I understood that any conversation I had with Robert before the process completed would compromise both my position and the investigation. So, I said nothing. I showed up for Thanksgiving at my parents' house in Tilbury with a green bean casserole, and I sat at the table with my father and my mother and Owen and his girlfriend, and I did not say a single word about any of it. My father gave a toast about family and about how important it was to show up for each other. He looked at me when he said it. I raised my glass. I smiled. I said nothing. What I have not told you yet is the year that came before. The period between September, when I first found the accounts, and November, when I filed the reports, was 9 weeks. 9 weeks of knowing and not saying. 9 weeks of continuing to answer the phone when Robert called, continuing to show up, continuing to behave as though I were the same person I had been in August. I was not the same person. I want to be careful about how I describe those 9 weeks because I think it is important to be honest about what they cost. I am a practical woman. I am organized and methodical, and I tend to solve problems by working through them rather than sitting inside the feeling. But there were nights during those 9 weeks when I sat at my kitchen table with the green folder in front of me and the handwritten ledger with its columns of charges and dates and amounts, and I felt something I did not know what to do with. It was grief, I think, or the specific kind of grief that arrives when you find documentation of what you had already half known for years without naming it. The worst of those nights was a Wednesday in October, the 22nd. It was 11:14 p.m. I had been going over the third account's charge history again, not because I needed to, I had it memorized by then, but because I could not stop returning to one specific charge. In August, a household furniture purchase, $847.33, at an address in Tilbury that was my parents' house, charged to an account in my name. Purchased, I later confirmed, for my parents' living room. I sat there with that single-line item, and I thought, he bought furniture for his own house with credit opened in my daughter's name, and he sat across from me at dinner and asked me how work was going. I put the folder in the kitchen drawer. I went and sat on the floor of my hallway with my back against the wall, the way you sometimes need a wall behind you when there is nowhere else to go. The hallway was dark except for the lamp in the living room around the corner. The copper kettle on the stove was still hot from the tea I had made and not finished. I could hear the neighbor's television through the shared wall, faint and incomprehensible, just the sound of other people's lives continuing. I sat there for a long time. I did not call anyone. I thought about calling Carly. I thought about calling my old friend B, who had known my family for 30 years and who would understand without my having to explain the whole architecture of it. What I thought, finally, was this: you already know what he did. You already know what you are going to do. Sitting on the floor is not going to change either of those things. I got up. I made fresh tea. I went to bed at 12:41 a.m. Some feelings are not problems to be solved before you can keep moving. They are just the cost of being the person who pays attention. In the weeks between November and Christmas, I had 2 calls with Carly. The insurance claim investigation was moving. The creditor disputes were being processed. My credit record would be corrected, Carly said, but the timeline depended on how the investigation resolved. She was calm and thorough and never once expressed an opinion about my father beyond the facts of the case, which I appreciated. I also, during this period, had coffee with my colleague Imani, not Imani from the name Pool, but a different person, a woman I had worked alongside for 11 years named Imani Torres, who was one of 3 people on Earth who knew what was happening. She had known since October. She had driven me to Carly's office the first time, sat in the waiting room with a paperback novel she'd read, and taken me for lunch afterward without asking how it had gone because she could see from my face exactly how it had gone. Imani said, at that December coffee, "Are you ready for Christmas?" I said, "I think so." She said, "Have you decided what you're going to say to him if he shows up?" I said, "I'm not going to say anything. The investigator will say it." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You know that's either going to go very cleanly or very badly." I said, "I know." She said, "Okay." And then she ordered us both a second coffee, and we talked about her daughter's school play for 20 minutes, and that was what I needed more than anything, to be a person who had a colleague and a second cup of coffee and a conversation about a school play, not just a person sitting in the middle of a document that told her things she had not wanted to know about her own father. Christmas morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of December morning in Millhaven where the light doesn't come up so much as seep in, pale and even, through windows that need washing. I had been awake since 5:40. I had made my tea. I had opened the leather appointment book to the flagged page, which had one thing written on it: the investigator's name, David Osei, and a phone number, though I did not need to call him. The process was already in motion. He had reached out to me the week before to confirm my address and let me know the timeline. He had not told me exactly when. He had said it would be in the holiday week, before the new year. I had not told him my father planned to come for Christmas. I had not engineered anything. I had simply not moved my holiday plans. At 8:47 a.m. my father's gray Buick parked at the curb. My mother got out of the passenger side with the casserole dish. Robert came around from the driver's side, moving the way he moves, deliberate, certain. The walk of a man who has always been accustomed to arriving somewhere and having it recognized as an arrival. He did not see the other car. It was parked around the corner, not yet visible from the curb. He knocked at 8:53. I opened the door. My mother said, "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," and I hugged her and took the casserole dish and stepped back to let them into the entry. My father crossed the threshold and looked at the house the way he always looks at it, assessing, comparing to some private standard he has never explained, and said, "You should get that gutter looked at. It's sagging on the left side." I said, "Good morning, Dad." He said, "Your mother made the sausage casserole. You should put it in the oven now so it stays warm." I said, "Of course." I took the casserole dish to the kitchen. I set it on the counter. I heard my father in the entry still, taking off his coat, saying something to my mother about the drive. The copper kettle was still warm on the stove from the tea I had made at 6. The green folder was in the drawer to my left. The handwritten ledger was next to it. I did not open the drawer. I had no reason to. The knock came 31 seconds later. A second knock, at the front door, while my father was still in the entry. I heard my father say, "Who's that?" And I heard my mother say, uncertainly, "I don't know." I came out of the kitchen and I stood in the hallway and I watched my father open my front door, because of course he opened it, because in Robert Galloway's understanding of reality, any door in any house his family occupied was a door he was entitled to answer. And I watched David Osei step up onto the porch in a gray overcoat with a bag over one shoulder and a folder in his hands. David was perhaps 55. Measured. Unhurried. The kind of man who has been to a great many houses for a great many reasons and is never surprised by who opens the door. He said, "Good morning. Is this the Galloway residence?" My father said, "Who are you?" David said, "I'm with Regional Insurance Claims Review. I'm here to speak with Fiona Galloway regarding open claims on file." He looked past my father. He saw me in the hallway. "Ms. Galloway, I believe we spoke last week." I said, "Yes. Come in." My father turned around. I had wondered, in the weeks since October, how my father's face would look when this moment arrived. I had run through several versions of it in my mind. The pivot, the deflection, the arrangement into pleasantness, the long silence before finding somewhere to put the discomfort. I did not know which one I would see. What I saw was none of those. What I saw was a man whose body understood what was happening a full 3 seconds before he could construct a response to it. He looked at me, then at David, then at the folder in David's hands, then at me again. He said, "Fiona." I said, "David, can I offer you coffee?" David said, Thank you, yes. My mother was standing absolutely still in the entry with her coat still on, holding her own purse with both hands, and she looked at me with an expression I did not know how to name and have spent time since trying to. I took David to the kitchen table. I poured coffee. I sat down across from him and I opened my own copy of the folder, the one I had kept, not the one Carly had filed, just my personal documentation, and we talked through the claims for 47 minutes, while my father stood in the doorway to the kitchen for the first 15, and then sat down in the chair at the end of the table and said nothing. He said nothing for 47 minutes. That is the truest thing I can tell you about that morning. David Osei left at 10:22 a.m. He shook my hand at the door. He said the process would take approximately 60 to 90 days to resolve fully, and that I would receive written communication from both his office and the creditors. He thanked me for my documentation, which he said was unusually thorough. I said, "I'm a tax accountant." He said, "It shows." My father was still at the kitchen table when I came back inside. My mother had taken off her coat and was standing at the kitchen counter not doing anything, just standing there, and when I came in she looked at me and said, "Fiona." I didn't know. I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "I didn't know any of it." I said, "I believe you." She sat down. She put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying exactly, just the gesture of someone who needs to not look at the room for a few seconds. I let her. My father said, from his chair at the end of the table, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since September." He said, "You didn't say anything." I said, "No." He said, "You could have come to me. You could have talked to me about this." I put my hands flat on the table. I looked at him. I said, "You opened credit accounts in my name, Dad. You bought furniture for your living room with credit in my name, and you sat across from me at Thanksgiving and asked me how work was going. What conversation would we have had?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. I said, "I'm not going to pretend this is a misunderstanding. I have the statements. I have the dates. I have the charge at your address for $847.33 in August." My mother made a sound that was not a word. My father said, "Things have been very difficult financially. I didn't want to worry anyone." I said, "I know." He said, "I was going to fix it. I was working on fixing it." I said, "I know you believe that." And I did. That is the thing I want to be careful about, because it would be easier to tell you that my father is simply a selfish man who took what he wanted and felt nothing.
He is not that.
He is a man who had been quietly terrified for 3 years, who had watched the financial structure he built his sense of himself around develop cracks he did not know how to acknowledge, who had made choices he told himself were temporary and manageable, and who had, in that very specific kind of desperate rationalization, used my name because my name was available and because I was the child who had always quietly absorbed what the family needed without making a scene. That is not an excuse. It is the shape of the thing, and knowing the shape of it is the only way I have found to stop carrying it, as though it were a mystery. I told my father I was not pressing criminal charges at this time. I want to say that plainly, because I think it matters. I was advised of my options. I chose not to go that route, not because what he did was acceptable, but because my mother has lived with this man for 46 years and she did not do this, and I was not going to blow her life apart more than it was already going to be blown apart by what was already in motion. What I told him was this: the insurance investigation would proceed regardless of my preferences, because that process belonged to the insurer, not to me. The credit disputes would be resolved and my record corrected. And from this point forward, I would not be available as a financial resource, named or unnamed, reported or unreported, asked or assumed. I said, "If you need help, I will help you find it. I will help you find a financial counselor. I will help you talk to someone who handles debt restructuring. But my name and my credit and my accounts are not going to be part of your solutions." He said, "Fiona, I said, "I'm not finished." He stopped. I said, "I love you. I am not going to stop being your daughter. But this doesn't happen again. Not in any form. If it does, that conversation ends differently." My mother reached across the table and put her hand over my father's. Not to comfort him, I think. To hold him still. To make him hear it. He nodded. It was not a reconciliation. I want to be precise. A single nod at a kitchen table on Christmas morning is not the same as understanding, and it is certainly not the same as repair. But it was the first time in my memory that I had set a boundary with my father while he was sitting in my kitchen, and had felt, afterward, that the floor was still under my feet. The 60 days that followed were not easy days. The investigation moved forward on its own timeline, which had nothing to do with what I wanted. There were phone calls and letters and follow-up documentation requests, and there was a period in January when I got 4 letters in 4 days, and I sat with all 4 of them on my kitchen table and felt a specific variety of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the work of it and everything to do with the fact that I was 47 years old, and this was how I was spending January. Owen called me on January 3rd. He knew, of course he knew, and he called me at 7:18 in the morning before I had made coffee, which meant he had been waiting to call, and had finally stopped waiting. He said, "I need to know where you're at with this." I said, "I don't have anything for you right now, Owen." He said, "He's your father." I said, "He's yours too." A silence. Then, "That's not fair." I said, "You were on the contact form for the second account." He went quiet. I gave him the quiet. He said, "I didn't know he was going to use your name." I said, "I believe that too." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I already did it." We didn't speak again for 6 weeks. When he called back in February, it was to tell me that he had talked to our father, that he had told him what he thought of it, and that he was sorry he had not done it sooner. I do not know exactly what Owen said to our father, or when, or with what force. I decided that was not mine to track. Imani brought me lunch at the office the Tuesday after Christmas. She set a container of soup on my desk and sat in the chair across from it and said, "Well?" I said, "He came. The investigator came. It all happened the way it happened." She said, "Are you okay?" I thought about it. I said, "I think I'm relieved mostly. And tired." She said, "That sounds about right." She stayed for 40 minutes. We talked about work and about her daughter, and about a book she had read over the holiday. She did not ask for details I had not offered, and she did not tell me what I should be feeling. She is one of the people who makes it easier to be a person, and I do not take that for granted. My credit record was corrected in full by March 4th. I received written confirmation on a Tuesday, and I read it standing at my kitchen counter with my tea, and I put it in a new folder, green like the others, and I put that folder in the drawer, and went to work. My father called me in March. We have talked 4 times since Christmas. They are short calls. Careful ones. He does not ask me for anything. He has started seeing a financial counselor, which my mother told me, not him. He has not apologized with words, not plainly, not in the way I might have wanted. He has said twice that he should have handled things differently, and those words sat in the air between us, and I did not ask them to be anything more than they were. I have thought about what my Aunt Helen, my father's sister, who died the year I turned 40, would have said about all of this. Helen Galloway was the kind of woman who said plainly what she thought and never seemed to lose sleep over the fact that people found it uncomfortable. She told me once, when I was 26 and had just let a colleague take credit for my work on a quarterly report for the 2nd time in a row, that a woman who lets people use her because she doesn't want to cause trouble eventually teaches people that she is available to be used. I think about that often. I think about what it means to be the kind of person in a family who absorbs, who quietly takes in what others put out, who reorganizes her own life around the gaps others leave, who tells herself it is strength to absorb and does not notice for a long time that it is also permission. I am 47 years old. I have a credit record that is correct and a green folder in a drawer and a colleague who brought me soup on a Tuesday. I have a father who is 68 and frightened in ways he cannot fully say, and who has not yet earned the trust he spent, and I love him anyway, and I am not going to be available to be used again. Those 2 things can both be true. They are both true. I want to leave you with something I have been carrying since October, since the floor of the hallway night, since the moment I got up and made fresh tea, and went to bed at 12:41 a.m. You cannot wait for the people who hurt you to understand what they did before you are allowed to respond to it. Understanding is not a prerequisite for action. They may never understand. The thing they did is still real, regardless. The people who love you without condition do not borrow your name for their convenience. They do not ask you to absorb what they are not willing to address themselves. Love is not a debt structure. It does not have a balance sheet. If someone in your life has been treating your goodwill as a line of credit, drawing on it without asking, carrying a balance they intend to settle someday, assuming you will not look too closely at the statements, you are allowed to audit. You are allowed to correct the record. A family that mistakes your patience for permission has made a calculation about you. You get to correct that calculation. Protecting yourself is not a betrayal. It is the beginning of every relationship that is actually real. And if you have spent years being the one who absorbs, who smooths, who shows up with the green bean casserole and says nothing, if you have let yourself be the manageable one so that everyone else could be complicated, I want you to know that the floor is still there when you stop. It does not fall away. You get to stand on it. What would it take for you to file the report?